All right, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here at Gonzaga University for our Common Home lecture series. My name is Dr. Brian Henning, and I am Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies here at Gonzaga, where I have the pleasure of directing the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. This is the latest in our series of events that we hold each semester. Really excited to be able to share our talk tonight and our speakers. Before we do, wanted to remind you that we have two more events after this one this semester. The next one in November, just before Thanksgiving, is a two-day international conference called the Columbia River Transboundary Governance and Ethics Symposium. This was really ends up being rather an important event because the Canadian government and the United States government just this last summer signed an agreement in principle regarding the Columbia River Treaty. And so this will be a really interesting two-day event, and encourage you to register for that. That one is a paid registration, but it'll be well worth it. And then our final event of the semester is on Tuesday, December 3rd. That's a Zoom event, free online on population, and that should be a really excellent opportunity to learn about a really interesting part of the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. Hosting these events and doing the work we do around climate literacy and climate resilience requires resources, and so if you have any to share, we would greatly appreciate it. It does make it possible for us to bring all these wonderful speakers and to do the work we do in the community. And now it's my great pleasure to go ahead and introduce our speakers for tonight. The way we're going to handle it, since we have four people who are all talking about different parts of the work that they jointly did together, each of the speakers will present from the podium for a little while, about 15 minutes or so. And then we'll shut the screen off and we'll bring out some chairs and have a discussion with the speakers. As you probably saw outside, there's an opportunity to buy the book. And so if you haven't done that yet and you're persuaded to do so afterwards, it should still be available. And I believe the authors would be willing to sign that for you potentially if you can get their attention afterwards. So consider doing that. So our four speakers tonight, the first is Dr. Greg Gordon, who's the editor of this volume, and my colleague. Dr. Gordon was born at the junction of Cherry Creek and the South Fork of the Platte River and spent much of his adult life living along the Clark Fork and the Dearborn Rivers. He now lives a short walk from the confluence of Hangman Creek and the Spokane River. He's a professor here of environmental studies at Gonzaga University. Second speaker is Margot Hill, who is a Spokane tribal member and grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She serves as the Associate Director of Small Urban, Rural, and Tribal Center on Mobility, or CERTCOM, at Eastern Washington University. Hill served as the Spokane Tribal Attorney for 10 years and as the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Court Judge. Hill earned her Juris Doctorate from Gonzaga University's Law School and her Master's in Urban and Regional Planning from Eastern Washington University. And third, we have Heidi Lasher. She spent more than 20 years working as a freelance communications and policy consultant, specializing in global health topics such as safe water, immunization services, vaccine supply chains, and family planning. In 2019, she pivoted from consulting and began writing her own work. Her nonfiction essays have been published in several different magazines and literary journals, including Orion, Prairie Schooner, Cream City Review, among others. She's currently working on a collection of essays about time, change, and growing older along the Spokane River, so keep an eye out for that book. And then finally, we have with us Bob Bartlett. Prior to retiring from Eastern Washington University in 2020, Bob spent 18 years at Gonzaga University, where he held a variety of enriching positions. We learned that we missed each other by 1 year. He left in 7 and I joined in 8. Unfortunately, we didn't overlap. His passion is family, fly fishing, learning, and storytelling. Bob considers himself a storyteller who's learning to write. Now, in retirement, his personal and professional goals include sharing the great outdoors with others who look like him, being a fly fishing educator and instructor, writing a monthly column on nature and wellness in Spokane's Black Lens newspaper, and being a life member of Trout Unlimited. Please join me in welcoming all four of our speakers, and first to speak, Dr. Greg Gordon.
You would just hold it? Well, then I've got to do two things at once. Hold the microphone. I know. All right. All right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up this evening. This is really exciting. I actually feel a little intimidated seeing all these faces. So let's see. I want to actually start by thanking the Climate Institute for hosting this event and many others you're probably aware of. But to keep in mind, this is just sort of the public face of the Climate Institute. The work that the Climate Institute does is incredibly impressive. Everything from climate literacy workshops for K through 12 elementary teachers to developing heat mapping to developing climate resilience centers throughout Spokane. So if you get a chance, look up the work that the Climate Institute does. And I just want to give a big shout out to Brian and Caitlin and all the volunteers that are working here at the Climate Institute. So, all right, I can't clap because I've got two things in my hand. Okay, so I thought I'd start about talking about the origins of sort of this book project because it took a lot of different turns. It all started with, like a lot of great things, with a group of students. Environmental studies students who on their senior capstone decided that they were going to restore Lake Arthur. And for those who aren't familiar with Lake Arthur, it's a pond down here by the Spokane River on the Gonzaga campus, surrounded by lawns. Lake Arthur didn't always look the way it does today. Any restoration project has to confront the question of, okay, restoration to what? What is the historical ecological baseline, and is that baseline even achievable or even desirable? So what was Lake Arthur previously? Well, during much of the 20th century, it was a mill pond. Let's see, there we go. This is Lake Arthur. It's a mill pond for the McGoldrick lumber mill, which is basically where the law school is today. Built in 1904, burned down in about 1945. This is the Trent, Hamilton, the causeway here. This is the Gonzaga campus. And it was an industrial, basically, waste pit for logs and other waste materials from the mill pond. After the lumber company burned down, it just sat there until the 1970s, and a group of students decided they were going to start cleaning it up. So, but what was it before that? What was its ecological, historical baseline? It was essentially a bend in the river. It looks something like this, a gravel bar. This isn't the Spokane River, this is on the Willamette. But, you know, the river comes around the corner, deposits a bunch of gravel, and it kind of looked like that. And this is what it looks like today. So, you know, today it is one of the most biologically diverse spots on the entire Spokane River. It's the only designated wetland in the city. It hosts herons, wood ducks, beavers, painted turtles, and it is a human creation. So it serves as an example of what ecologists are now referring to as novel ecosystems, which raises the question, okay, what's a novel ecosystem? So bear with me for a little bit of academic background here. Ecologists generally place ecosystems on, there we go, on a bit of a spectrum. So these aren't hard boundaries, but things happen along the spectrum. So let's start with a natural historical ecosystem or a wild system. This is what we typically think of as, you know, a natural system, national forest, a national park. It's in its sort of natural state. And it functions without a lot of human manipulation or interference. You can do some, you know, indigenous burning, maybe some light logging, some grazing, but it still retains most of its general sense of its historical natural condition. It doesn't necessarily mean it's like totally pristine, but it basically, its functions haven't changed. And then something happens. A shift occurs in which the ecosystem begins to move outside the range of historical variability. more frequent and intense wildfires. They move beyond sort of their normal historical fire regime. A lower snowpack, increased flooding. We're seeing these things happen all over the world today. And you could ask yourself, well, is the planet now a native ecosystem? Be a good question. Presence of invasive species. Things begin to change, and it moves into a hybrid system. It retains a lot of the characteristics, but it has a lot more species, different species, non-native species. Things are happening outside the range of historical variability. And it can still be restored. Hybrid systems can go back to be restored like the Elwha, right? They removed the dam and the salmon came back. We were just talking about the Klamath, the biggest dam removal ever in the world, and 4 dams on the Klamath being removed. Salmon are now back in Oregon. So you can do something and those ecosystems come back. But in many systems, they pass an ecological threshold where the return to the previous state is no longer possible. Abiotic changes have occurred in the soil, substrates, dams on a river. Change the hydrology permanently. They change the flood regime, they change the soil composition, they change the nutrient cycling. It's a new and different ecosystem with a whole bunch of new and different species, right? We no longer have salmon on the Spokane River. We have red-banded cutthroat, but we have a whole bunch of new species that have showed up, and it's unlikely to return, and it becomes a novel ecosystem. But it still functions without human manipulation. It kind of works as a self-sustaining ecosystem, even though it's a product of human interference, human manipulation. A lot of abandoned places can become novel ecosystems, as opposed to a designer ecosystem like a park, a farm, something that requires continual human maintenance. A novel ecosystem can be considered sort of an accident, right? It's a whole new thing, and it functions on its own, but that whole new thing is a product of human intervention, human manipulation, human artifice, if you will. So, what I want to go look at some of the characteristics of novel ecosystem, and I think one way of sort of thinking about this is, when we look at this, is the Spokane River a novel ecosystem? So, novel ecosystems, you have new species combinations and abundances, right? New species show up, they're in a different suite of abundance. There's often unintentional degradation of the native system, abandonment, and the ecosystem's been severely changed by anthropogenic human-caused actions. There's been a shift in the abiotic system, right? The nutrient cycling, nitrogen cycles, phosphorus, carbon, all those cycles have changed. And most importantly, they've crossed a threshold where restoration or return to the previous state is unlikely or even impossible, and possibly, and I would like to suggest this, may not always be desirable. It may not be what we want is return. We may not want a gravel bed anymore at Lake Arthur. We may want the wetland that it's become. And the one characteristic is it survives on its own. Humans don't need to be there for this new system to continue to function and operate. It is a new suite of species, new combination of species. It still functions, it has different functions, and it self-sustains itself without humans, a lot of human manipulation. So, when we were looking at Lake Arthur, the students and I had to come up with a term. Well, restoration, well, we just talked about how that didn't really fit, because we're not restoring it back to its original condition. So, renaturalizing, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting term. Revitalization, enhancement, yeah, we're putting things in there to make it kind of more biologically diverse. We're enhancing the system, right? It can now house painted turtles and beavers where it didn't have any of those things before. Beautification, well, that kind of means sprucing it up, getting rid of, some of the, shopping carts and trash, certainly. So a whole bunch of different terms. For Lake Arthur project, the students settled on enhancement. Boise River, through the city of Boise, has the Boise River Enhancement Plan. So they like the term enhancement. I kind of like the term rewilding. Renaturalizing and revitalization are probably more accurate, but they don't capture the imagination. They don't say, here's something that we as humans can sort of do and capture that idea that these systems can operate on their own. They don't need us to keep continually, we don't need us to continue to manipulate them, and we can back away. And so I kind of like this idea of things like herons and egrets showing up without us putting them there. This is a picture of the South Platte as it runs through the city of Denver. Mile High Stadium is right around the corner. The engineers that did this, they put those rocks in there and they realized that we could cement the rocks in, and then they said, you know what if we just let the rocks move around themselves and figure out where they want to go? So, I think the idea of, and we can come back to that question if people are interested in the terms, rewilding sort of gives us a little more, imagination, or suggests that maybe there's more to this than just engineering projects. So we begin to look at these different projects. I went quite a number of places. I went to Denver and the Boise, and of course Spokane River and the San Antonio River, and the Clark Fork River, and I was trying to figure out a couple things. What I discovered really surprised me, that not only are urban rivers in the country in better condition than they've ever been in the past 100 years, but each river has a devoted cadre of people actively working to enhance those systems. There's urban planners, civil engineers, fly fishers, activists, everywhere. What was interesting is people across the political spectrum. It didn't matter who they were going to vote for. The cultural spectrum, economic, you had people who were very wealthy and people who were working class people, all very passionate about their particular local river. And it was these slices of nature that were running through our cities that fostered these really neat connections to the natural world, even though, or maybe because they were so damaged. Maybe it was the damage that we had done that brought people to those places. But regardless, there was this love that people had of these kind of polluted, kind of trashy urban rivers. And so all of this sort of led me to the question that we tried to explore on the book. The central sort of organizing question is, could wild nature and human artifice be reconciled into something functional that can foster both biodiversity and human needs? In other words, could the Anthropocene provide its own antidote? In other words, as more human and natural systems merge, could this merging address the root cause of the climate crisis, which I see as the inability to recognize our interdependence with the natural world? Could urban rivers get us to the point where, hey, the recognition that we need those rivers, they need us, and that the human and natural worlds are no longer separate? And maybe that was sort of could be an opening into thinking about how we can rethink conservation. It's not just a place that we sort of lock up and put it, say, okay, it's out there, it's going to be safe from people. It's a place that we're actively engaged in. We're actually actively engaged in planting the willows. We're actually actively engaged in pulling the tires out of the rivers. And so as I kind of continued to sort of look at these places, I realized that the local experts knew more about the rivers than I did and really cared deeply about them. So instead of writing a book that I was working on, I said, okay, well, let other people tell their stories. And so this Rewilding the Urban Frontier is sort of the result of all of those stories. And tonight, Really delighted to have 3 of the contributors to the book with us to tell about their personal connection to their home waters. And what I think was particularly interesting about the connection between Heidi, Bob, and Margot is the through line that connects them to the Spokane River. Heidi is going to share her personal journey of connecting the Spokane River. Bob's story is more of the connection between multiple generations to their home rivers. And then Margot's story transcends the personal and generational to address the deep, deep cultural connection that the Spokane tribe has to its river. And so we have sort of this tiered approach. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Heidi Lasher, who is going to talk about the Spokane.
I've got to get my reading glasses. Sorry. So when Greg asked me to contribute a chapter to this book, I was sort of surprised because I am not an academic nor an expert on the Spokane River or any river. But he had read some of my work about the Spokane River, and he did something unusual in this book, which is to include some personal accounts, some personal essays mixed with the academic writing of experts on different rivers around the West. And so I'm going to read a little bit from my essay rather than just tell you about it. There are 2 threads in the chapter I wrote. One is about my personal story, and it describes how this particular urban river came into view for me at a particular time in my life. The other thread is about paddling from Coeur d'Alene Lake to Post Falls Dam. This is a 13-mile stretch that starts in Coeur d'Alene Lake. It looks a lot like Coeur d'Alene Lake the whole way through, but it's the river. Seeing what the river contains of its past and what it shows us about the future. And so I'll read a passage from my chapter that touches on both those themes, starting with my more personal thread. Before that year, I hadn't understood much about the Spokane River. I didn't have a good sense for it, where it came from, where it went, and what it passed along the way. I had hardly glanced at it. Something had changed in the preceding months. For no discernible reason, the river became visible to me. It drew me to it like a magnet. I began running and biking alongside it, stopping awkwardly to snap pictures of it. When I wasn't near the river, I scrolled through pictures I had taken, read books about the river, and studied maps to get a sense for its size and scale. Before long, I craved physical contact with the river. I yearned for a visceral experience of the cold and heavy spring flood, to feel it slice through my arteries and rush past my organs on its way down to my feet and out again. I could not explain this urge. It felt instinctual and compulsive. When I admitted my obsession to my husband or friends, I felt jittery and exposed, and I'd almost giggle the river's name out loud, aware of how absurd I sounded. My newfound passion for the river confused people who knew me well, for I am not known to exhibit zealous behavior. My astrological sign is Libra, represented by the scales, eternally balanced and even-keeled. I am part stoic, hardworking Norwegian, part pragmatic, humorless Swiss German. I majored in economics. I don't fall for much. Plus, the Spokane River is kind of gross. It's neither pristine nor particularly wild. It's not very long, not known for its whitewater or its fishing, though it has both. Not easy to access. There are healthier and more productive rivers nearby in Idaho and Montana. After it departs from Coeur d'Alene Lake in Idaho, the Spokane slides past uninspiring homes, trailer parks, ponderosa forests, and undeveloped lands. Past strip malls and gravel pits and industrial parks, it pours straight through the downtown core of the mid-sized city of Spokane, meanders through a state park, then along the Spokane Indian Reservation, and finally into the Columbia River. There are 7 dams along the Spokane River, leaving a good portion of the water stagnant and choked with noxious weeds and algae. The free-flowing sections can be littered with garbage, empty beer cans, carpet remnants, tires, and crumbling concrete. In flat water stretches, the river bank is hardscaped and lined with docks and motorboats. The downtown section of the river is festooned with placards warning residents to stay out, stay alive. I think I have a slide of that. This is to prevent unsuspecting swimmers and boaters from being sucked into the hydraulics of the dam or being dragged over the Spokane Falls. But people tend to interpret the message generally and steer clear of the river. As for me, I'd begun to paddle the entire length of it. By the time I canoed with Merritt, I had already traveled up tributaries, sat in on meetings, and studied historical pictures of the river where it crisscrossed with railroad tracks. I had learned the names of birds and the locations of beaver lodges and the natural history of the signal crayfish, a spectacular orange and turquoise mini lobster that hunts by the light of the moon. The river had appeared at a turning point in my life. I had become disenchanted with work and decided to spend more time at home. My kids needed less of me, but I seemed to require more of myself. I'd lost track of who I was. And as I wandered the house, wondering what I'd do next, I began to look around. Not just metaphorically, but literally. Where on earth was I? What were my geographic, spatial, and temporal coordinates? Where did I come from, and where was I going? So, this first passage sort of illustrates to me how important urban rivers are to people like me who wake up one day in their late 40s and wonder where they are. Urban rivers, as Greg said, are some of the wildest places near cities, and they can often be the place we go to find ourselves. When I canoed this section of the river described in my chapter, I was partway through my journey of paddling the entire river. I was with my friend Merritt, who moonlights as a spiritual regression therapist, which means that she analyzes past lives with people. And I thought that would be a good metaphor for this section of the river, because it was clear to us both when we were paddling that there was a deep tension on the river. The south side of the river seemed to represent the past. It was wilder and it was lined with coniferous forests, old cabins and tea roses and rowboats hidden in tall grass. And the right side of the river, the north side of the river, seemed to represent the future. The riverbank was under a new phase of development with luxury condos being built right at the river's edge, and there were docks and retaining walls and green lawns. And we knew that at the bottom of the river and the lake, there were 75 million tons of heavy metals deposited over 100 years of mining in the Silver Valley, and knew that if oxygen levels in the lake dropped low enough, that those metals could rise and poison the water. So I'm going to read another short section. On the day of my paddle with Merritt, it was hard to imagine any of this happening. It seemed far-fetched to believe that one person's building project or lawn fertilizer could change the chemistry of a huge shimmering lake surrounded by woods in the middle of Idaho. But I remember looking up at the sky from the unnaturally placid river and feeling a humming tension between the two sides of the river, between the past and the future, wondering how to move forward. I may have been projecting my own sense of paralysis. In the past, I felt like anything was possible. Time seemed endless and no goals felt out of reach. But I'd lost my momentum. I'd lost touch with my ambition. No longer young or full of energy, I could not envision my next steps. The daily news documented a world in crisis. The years ahead filled me with dread. Night after night, I would bolt awake at 3 a.m. in a pool of sweat with my heart racing, impotent to stop or slow the frantic pace of human destruction and consumption, the changing climate, political division. I wanted to go back in time, back to some kind of beginning. I felt as if I were pulling with my whole body, mutely screaming for everyone to stop. There was a time when the Spokane River was clean, full of clean, clear water that tumbled over stones, alive with native trout and migrating salmons, insects, ducks, and otters. The water would have been shaded by cattails, willows, and pine trees. It would have been a peaceful and quiet, or perhaps loud with noise of its own making. I wanted to go back to that Eden. If we went back just 150 years, I reasoned, we could refill the mines, unbuild the dams, save the salmon, protect the trees, safeguard the water. If we could unwind the clock 2 centuries, we could roll back our dependence on fossil fuels, reverse climate change. White settlers could start fresh with Native Americans and undo smallpox and land grabs, boarding schools, and reservations. Going back a little further, merchants could reverse the slave trade. Bishops could rethink the Crusades. Warriors could subdue the conquering impulse. You're stuck in the past. See how your back is rounded? My sister, a yoga teacher, came for a visit that spring. She shuffled behind me and pushed both feet against my back, causing me to arch slightly and sit forward on my perineum. There, she said, you can sit longer in this position. You are more open and balanced. You can face the future this way. My physical therapist said something similar when I went to see her about sciatic nerve pain. She watched me for a minute. I'm going to adjust my posture. She watched me for a minute, and after pressing her palms into my glutes, said, "You're standing on the backs of your heels. Try shifting your weight forward." After a week of conscious effort to move my weight toward the balls of my feet, the pain disappeared. It was time to let go of the past, not ignore it. The trauma we've inflicted on each other and on the environment is real and durable. It's embedded in the landscape. It sits at the bottom of the lake. It hovers invisibly over the tense meetings between the tribe and the state. To ignore it is to live in a perpetual state of denial, but to recreate it is folly. I thought then about Merritt's job of releasing people from traumatic experiences and past lives. I wondered if she could release us from the trauma of our collective past lives. Could she help us let it go? Would letting it go help us face the future? Help us change our ways? I didn't understand it then, but I realize now that the crux of my anxiety over the river and the central question of my midlife emerged from a struggle to manage change. I'd been wishing to go back in time to reverse environmental damage and restore the lake and the river to an arbitrary Eden. I had been looking longingly over my shoulder at my younger years when the horizon looked longer, the possibilities endless. I had been begging for time to stop. I'd forgotten that Earth and everything on it is in a constant state of flux. Grass grows, tadpoles become frogs, generations pass, species go extinct, even mountains move. Glaciers carve new landscapes, rivers change course, volcanoes erupt and winds erase and pile new contours. Everything is capable and designed for change. The past does not condemn us, it only tethers us to the future. It illuminates our choices. Although my generation did not run the mines that polluted this lake, we have an opportunity to mitigate the damage. We did not build the dams, but we can choose how long to keep them operating and at what cost. We did not negotiate treaties between Native Americans and the US government, but we can uphold what was promised and acknowledge what was lost. If we cannot restore the lake to what it once was, perhaps we can imagine what it might still become. Merritt and I finished our paddle in silence and drove together back to Coeur d'Alene. When she dropped me off at my truck, I walked to the lake's edge where the river pulls away to the west and kicked a pile of goose poop. Since the beginning, this unremarkable river has been moving towards something bigger than itself, relentlessly seeking its own transformation. As I watched its quiet movement, I felt my weight shift forward. Sorry. I didn't expect that to be emotional, but that's how it is sometimes with our connections to nature. And I'm going to pass the microphone now to Margot.
Heo putis yn sihu putis yn gwely putis lychlacht llwy squest zipani llwys yn yapan sin squest Margot Hill. Good evening. My tribal name is Margot, is Tsipani, which was a nickname that I have from since I was a little girl. It was a game that we would play mimicking the sound of a bird. As I spoke in my chapter, my chapter is called "We Buried Our People Along the River," and I could speak to you as a formal tribal attorney. I've been in federal court on water adjudication issues, but I'm going to speak to you from more of a cultural lens. And in my chapter, I tell our creation story that was shared by Chief Lott, Oliver Lott, and actually by other tribal members as well. My great-grandmother, Sadie Boyd, told the story, and this is my great-grandfather, Basil Pion, and his father, who owned the land, actually, that Gonzaga bought, and my two older children. These are my grandmother and aunties, and then my mother. But I want to tell the creation story that my grandmother has shared, and I'm going to share some of it in my language, but I will translate as well. So this is a story my great-grandmother told from a long time ago. He went to Harip, Stulich, Spast, met mutels. In Shiit to El Sout. So my great-grandmother told this story about how suddenly the ground shook and it bubbled up, and from the first until the last. Shit, measly, squelly, heads, heads, the squelly, the tribal people, they ran helter-skelter, and they sobbed and they wailed. Quent niskulpulau si astulich, ye heads mok. The ground it tore apart, and the mountains tore apart. Quently she heads deep of me. Now hui youth. He sil heads ya. And everything was falling in. The trees and the animals, everything was falling in. Quentlia heads, Toretti heads, Uwenchinti heads, Debasi, Hoi per stulich. And then there was thunder, and there was lightning, and there was rain, and all of the ground flooded the land. Heads as south chi as south mist at weeds mis shashutim chinchao just seats kusum tisha heads. So in the end, there was one young man and one young woman, and then they met up on Mount Spokane, and from there they watched, and tisha heads odds hoi heads all selk. And from there that they could see that things got better and that the water, it began to drain. Huichis che shoot heads mop. Huichis ye quam step met skahetks. And so they saw the most beautiful. They followed that water, and they seen the most beautiful waterfall, and it was Skahet, the Spokane Falls. That we say Spokane, Skahet, place of fast-moving water. He ni lu slichet inset simplich sin huamena. Look. What is that? What is that there in the water? It is a salmon. It is a steelhead. Tished chisel seats slu sint utuli skatsen ilni sin huamena. And from those salmon and the river we get life. The upper Spokane, the middle Spokane, and the lower. That is a story that my people have shared by oral history for thousands of years. The Spokane people, we are physically, culturally, and spiritually connected to the river and to the salmon. I share in my chapter the creation story told by Chief Lot to an Indian agent, but the story that I just shared in our language was actually a story my great-grandmother told. You know, geologists and scientists, they come behind us, and they tell the story of the Missoula floods, and they explain scientifically what happened in this area, the glacier floods that cut through and the flooding that was here, and how our people, you know, we talk about the Spokane River, and it's very sacred to us. And so much has happened to our people. You know, my great-grandmother also talked about, because she was lived to be 103 and passed away in 1986. She talked about the building of the river, of the dams, and how hard it was on our people, and how they said, oh, there's going to be electricity. You can flip a switch and the lights will come on. And she said, but what will we feed our children? And they said, well, don't worry. You know, you can push a button and your homes will be heated. And she said, but what will we feed our children? And so hydropower brings cheap power to everybody in the Northwest. And the irrigators clear to the Tri-Cities have the benefit of the hydropower of Grand Coulee Dam and Little Falls Dam and all the dams along the Spokane and Columbia rivers. But our people paid a great price. We lost our way to feed ourselves. Probably 70-80% of our diet was salmon. And our grandmothers talked about, you know, when growing up, we only knew pan fry, you know, a little something. But our grandmothers talked about salmon that would hang from a saddle of a horse and almost touch the ground. They were 50, 60, 70-pound salmon. And so when we think about the hydropower and our loss of way of life, you know, we had a salmon chief that would ask one young man to sing a song to call those salmon home. We no longer have that opportunity for leadership. That is lost. And our people used to travel up and down the rivers by canoe. And so I wanted to share a little of the cultural aspect. Our people, through UCUT, our scientists, our biologists, have been working really hard to restore the Spokane River. And we are, you know, working with other agencies and buying land and putting it in preservation. And we are working to restore salmon to the Spokane River. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about our people and what we are doing now. You know, from the time of the building of Grand Coulee Dam, the waters flood, and we think that we can engineer Mother Earth. And they flooded our homelands, and they burned down homes, and we had even crops and things along the river. And all of that was lost with the flooding of Grand Coulee Dam. In my chapter, I talk about how there was some white men putting stakes in the ground, and along comes Chief Jim James, and he said, what are you guys doing? And they said, don't you know? We're building this dam that's going to block the river, and it's going to flood this area. And so the engineers and the people that were making all the decisions, the federal agencies, contacted the non-Indians across the river and purchased their land. The Spokanes, our homes were burned, and we lost so much. And it was our practice to bury our people along the river. And so they had spent time reburying the non-Indian grave sites. And just days before the flooding, they began to rebury our people. And it was such a rushed, hurried job. there was no scientific documentation. They hired Ball and Dodd to come out and do it. And there's a film called Echoes of Yesterday, and it's just so sad to watch. And the story is really one that looks like there's a time and the tribal people are celebrating. I was talking to the head of our culture department this afternoon, and he said that actually his great-grandpa was hired. They hired tribal people to help move the bodies, the remains. But it was just such a challenging time because it was so rushed. And then, of course, not all of the bodies, all of the remains were exhumed. So clearly, we still have our people that are buried along the river that when they flood, they flood Lake Roosevelt, and then they draw it down. And this constant, up and down, it creates sloughs of land. And it's really hard for the ecology, and it's hard on the land. But we are working in spite of all that happened with Grand Coulee Dam. We are working to protect the Spokane River, and we are reclaiming some of our ancient pastimes, and we are once again traveling along the river. I wanted to share just a little bit of one of our tribal elders spoke to our young people. My kids all paddle in the canoe journeys, and they camp up and down the Spokane River and the Pend Oreille River, and the Columbia rivers. They will paddle for 7 and 8 days, and they will have sunburns and mosquito bites, and they will be woke up to eagles screeching at 5 a.m. But it's made them stronger and connected to our ancestors. And so I just wanted to share Francis Kaluuya. He's a Kalispel tribal elder that just recently passed away. And Francis said, for the Calvos, the Spokanes, the Kalispel, the Coeur d'Alenes, and the Salish, it has always been a dream to getting back out onto the water, our rivers. And Francis spoke to our young people as he stood along the banks of the Pend Oreille. He said, in our way of thinking, in our way of life, the canoe journey is like our winter dances because it brings all of our tribes together into one place. To me, it's a blessing, and it gives me a good feeling to be part of the canoe journey. Little did I know that one day I would be standing here talking to you and speaking in this manner. This is important for you as a young person. Many of you young people that come here, you are building your strength. You are building your life. One day that strength will be here in your prayers and your thoughts. One day when life comes at you and things get tough, this strength will be with you. Our Creator is watching over us. Today, our people still gather along the river, and we have canoe journeys, and you might not always see us along the rivers. But we gather when they built Grand Coulee Dam, the Calvo tribal elders, and there's many tribes, the Sinicht from Canada, that are part of the Calvo Confederated Tribes today, gather at Kettle Falls. And the last gathering before the dam was stopped the river from flowing was called the Ceremony of Tears. Today, we still gather at Kettle Falls, and we have a salmon ceremony. And this was a number of years ago, but one of our tribal elders, Richard Armstrong, spoke. And he said, we gather for the salmon ceremony, for all the people and the paddlers. He asked us to pick up rocks and pound them together. And with the rhythm of these rocks, we speak the language of the salmon. We are doing this from our heart. We are working to maintain the sacredness of our waters. As tribal people, we carry on what our ancestors did. To do this work, we keep our memories, the ones who took care of the rivers. We continue the ways of our ancestors. We sing the sturgeon song, and we sing the salmon song. We remember Martin Louis, who said, "The salmon know no boundaries." They travel the world to all of our people. When we pray for the sacredness of the river. And we pray for the river to be clean. We pray for the animals, for the children that are not born yet. As Squeli, as tribal people, we know it is our responsibility to pray and sing for the river. As indigenous people, we do these ceremonies for the river, and we want to be there to support it because the river has always supported us. So as I mentioned, I could talk about some of the legal issues. I was part of a team of lawyers, Mary Werner and Dave Lundgren, who applied for treatment as a state for the Spokane Tribe under the Clean Water Act. And the Spokane Tribe is working really hard. We have some of the highest water quality standards anywhere, and people get really pissy about them. But because we're downriver, and they say those are impossible to meet, whether it's PCBs or whatever it is. But clean, cold, fast-running water is good for all of us. Of course, our river is connected to our aquifer. And so I ask you to keep advocating for the Spokane River. I appreciate Brian and all of his students who work here at the Institute for Water and the Environment. And I appreciate it because we think about the degradation that we put into our river. We used it as a garbage can and a sewer, but there's so much that we can love and cherish about our environment. Greg asked us to think about our passion for the river. What is our personal connection? So we think about for future generations and our ability for their ability, food sovereignty and the ability to feed themselves. We think about the water rights of tribes and the priorities because the tribal people, the indigenous people are fighting from here to Canada for clean, fast-running water. And so we think about the winner's decision. As we move forward, there's going to be many a battle over water. Our scientists and our staff are working to restore salmon. Greg does an amazing job in the introduction of talking about this new life cycle of the salmon, that we are reintroducing salmon to the river. Sometimes we have to truck them past dams, but we're tracking them and we're reintroducing them to tributaries. This is Pat Moses, one of our tribal elders, who served as a teacher for nearly 35 years at Wapiti School District, and he's a veteran. Him and the children are introducing the water. But if we all work together and we stand together, we can bring salmon back to our tributaries. You know, there are forces that are trying to misinform our leaders right here in Spokane about water and dams. You know, there's some tributaries on the Snake River. We've seen so much success on the removal of other dams that it's possible for some of the lower snake dams that we can think about. But here in Spokane, we're doing our part. And so as I tell you, our young people are once again returning to the rivers with the canoe journeys, and they're finding strength. And we are singing the songs for our salmon. And as tribal people, we remember this. And I just finish by saying, yes, we buried our people along the river. And the workers reburied them during the building of the dams in the sacred lands. They continued to desecrate our ancestral remains, and today they still resurface. Yet through the dedicated and diligent revival of our culture, our stories, our ceremonies, our people demonstrate resilience and maintain our connection to the river. We are once again reclaiming our waterways with our canoe journeys and salmon ceremonies, as well as by advocating for clean water to return the salmon to our local waters. We are keeping our sacred promise to the river, and we will continue to sing the song until the salmon return home. Lemlemsh.
I always wanted a back cleanup. How much time do we have? I always mention to folks, when you ask a storyteller to tell a story and they say, you have 15 minutes, that's not good. My name is Bob Bartlett, and I'm the proud second son of the late Walter Taylor Bartlett Sr. and Frances Bartlett, who turned 101 last week. My river story is a collection of memories. Memories of joy, loss, regret, and sorrow. It is a lament not just for what once was, but for what still is. Creeks choked by earth and rock-filled dams, upstream watersheds struggling to survive, and a people gone from the waters which long sustained them. My chapter is personal. It's chapter 11, titled A River Lament, New Creek and the People Who Lived It Near to Death. As early as I can remember, my step-grandmother kept a fishing pole next to her kitchen door for me. The pole was a stripped, tapered branch of birch with kite string for line and a safety pin for a hook. Thin strips of beef bologna served as bait. She would wrap the bologna with a slice of Wonder Bread or some oyster crackers in newsprint. As I bolted for the creek across the street, she would call out, "Baby, if the fish aren't biting, remember you still have lunch." She was Grandpa's third wife. Although we weren't related by blood, she loved my brother and me as if we were her own. Within a short distance of New Creek in Kaiser, West Virginia, 4 generations of my family lived, died, and are buried. They were hardworking, deeply patriotic, small-town country folks who knew how to live off the land. They loved to hunt and fish, skills purposefully passed on to their children. In Kaiser in the 50s and 60s, black people were of the river and of the land. New Creek ran clear and cool most of the year, maintaining a healthy river smell of streamside flowers, honeysuckles, ferns, rushes, and river moss. It ran free of coal mine and paper mill waste. Its shallow runs, pools, and back eddies were home to a diverse population of fish. But heavy spring rains and swollen mountain feeder streams regularly turned New Creek a deep mocha, and its unencumbered volume burst over the short flood wall. The river's sediment left behind enriched gardens, and random deposits of driftwood became yard art. Human inhabitants and those of the untamed creek, by the way, that's spelled C-R-I-C-K, coexisted back then. My family cleaned up after floods, and once the water subsided, took what they needed from the creek until it flooded again. Most importantly, they never tried to tame the creek or protect their homes from it. Floods were nothing personal, simply an accepted consequence of dwelling close to the creek. A healthy, unpredictable New Creek contributed to their sense of well-being. The opening of fishing season was a legitimate skip school day. In the fall, we roamed the creek or the mountains near town before sunup and still would manage to arrive at school before the opening bell. We played outdoors as kids, just as our parents did before us. And like them, we often flirted with dangers. Our parents and grandparents believed that the heavily forested mountains or New Creek, even during times of high water and cold winds, would never hurt us. Pop's love for free-flowing rivers grew in me and set me up for a rude awakening later in life. With new understanding, I began to see the abuse and long-term consequences of living with the fantasy that our damaged or altered natural resources will always remain limitless and fixable. We share a dangerous assumption that if we break or ruin our green spaces, advancements in science and technology will heroically fix our mistakes. No harm, no foul. However, few human fixes come without consequences. We have learned too late that nature can be broken beyond easy fixes. And communities can also be broken beyond repair. We can, in fact, love our natural world near to death. What has been done to New Creek may be irreversible. Rewilding is possible. However, an improved ecosystem for New Creek, one even better than before dams, is easier to imagine than the return of a vibrant Black community to the valley. We had an abundance of social capital back then, the kind earned when you live in right relations with one another, a creek, and public land. I continue to long for the ancestral connection of place, the people like the ones of my youth and a birch stick. I mourn the loss of living close to the land as we did, close to family and a wild urban creek. I will forever mourn the loss of the threads that bound us together. I have always lived near a river or a creek. Before my family and I moved to the upper left, a term I recently learned, we lived on Colorado's west slope, only a mile or so from the Colorado River. We moved to Pullman for graduate school and then to Spokane in 1989. We have lived in the same house in the valley ever since, only 8 minutes from the Spokane River. Seeing the Spokane River was love at first sight. I have floated it, walked its banks, and fished it ever since. Whenever I do, I feel a deep sense of connection to its history, the people that once lived along it, the fish that once lived here, and my own story. Most importantly, I experience a deep feeling of gratitude and a responsibility to protect the river. 2 Fridays ago, I floated and fished the Spokane with a small group of Black and brown folks, friends of mine. Not only did we catch native red band trout, we also saw recently reintroduced salmon put there by the Spokane tribes. Through the clear water, the salmon looked as long as my arm. To see them there, swimming where they once gathered by the thousands, where they once fed, quote, the people, culturally, spiritually, and physically, was a sacred moment. In 2023, I reached out to my Black and brown Spokane River guests that were just here, who are all fly anglers and environmental activists from across the country. We are now a nonprofit group known as the Ubuntu Fly Anglers Network. We floated and fished the Spokane River together, and thanks to Margot and her son Craig, we heard the creation story of the river as you just did, and the people who once flourished here. Why? Because as a people, we recognize the power of story. We recognize individually and collectively the importance of nurturing, mentoring, and supporting one another and the current and next generation of folks who look like us that will soon be the statistical majority in this country. It will be to our peril if we do not encourage them to replace us outdoors. The Spokane River is not the same as what the ancestors of these current salmonids once knew, nor are the people who live along it. The river still runs clear and cold much of the time and is clean enough to sustain this generation. Both need our protection. We are truly blessed to live in a city with such a river and a people's rich history running through it. I recently heard that Spokane is one of the few cities in the entire country with a river running through it that holds native trout. Margot shares in her chapter that the Spokane tribe's connection to the river and its banks cannot be overstated, that they are river Indians. Dams and the tribe's removal from the river drastically changed their way of life and the river's way of life. Although removed from it decades ago, the Spokane tribes continue to fight to protect both the cultural resources and the water's quality to bring back the salmon. She writes, "We are keeping our sacred promise to our rivers, and we will continue to sing the songs until the salmon return home." Margot's story of her people and the river and my river lament are very similar. Her people and mine were river people, and the construction of dams and our removal from the rivers we once knew changed us and them forever. Heidi in our chapter shares, although we were not responsible for past wrongs, we can imagine what might be. In a chapter after mine, Ian Stevenson writes about rewilding. Rewilding represents another example of how rivers exist as hybrid landscapes where human culture and nature remain indelibly intertwined and thus altered one necessarily affects the other. The benefits, as real as they are, were never intended for the local population as much as for the new influx to replace them. Interesting. In the end, we are all called to be river people. We all have a responsibility to live in right relations, to learn from our past mistakes, to once again be protectors and stewards of the land. We must do better. Most importantly, whatever we are doing now, whatever we do in the future, we must include the once removed and the once excluded in our efforts to protect our urban rivers. Thank you. Oh, I forgot to, I'm sorry. Let me show you the pictures. Can I show you the pictures? Thanks for reminding me. What button do I push here? The right arrow, okay. Okay, the right arrow, come on. I don't know. It doesn't want me to show you the pictures.
Oh, I think
It went to sleep.
there we go.
Whoops, okay. Whoop, okay. Okay, so this is part of my family. I'm the little one in the front. I'm the cute one in the front. My brother, my older brother is the one over by the license plate. That's my cousin Frances, Peachy, and her brother Randy. That's my father with his foot on the bumper, and my mother getting out of the car, and the person in the hat is my dad's dearest friend and fishing buddy, and we were fishing in his place. So this was 2 Fridays ago. Thanks to the Spokane River Keeper folks and Mark Fritt, who's sitting in the back, who was the lead guide for the group that was here. We set sail down at Red Band Park, and we fished and floated down to TJ Menock. And it was a dream come true. And one of our members, within 5 minutes, hooked up with this really, really nice red band. So in the end, this is who we are now. This is the Ubuntu Fly Anglers Network leadership team who were here together last week. And one of our members, the person on the right, that's Dr. You're right. That's Dr. Lolita Robinson from Wilmington, North Carolina. She came out. She's an MD and an MBA. That's Erin Lipsker. She actually lives here in Spokane, and that's my second oldest daughter. She works for School District 81. That's Scott Simmons from Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's another daughter, Jamie, who lives in Bozeman, Montana. And that's yours truly on the other side. And then the person next to me is Carl Crawford from Los Angeles, California. And next to her is Emma Trout, who is a fly angling guide and outfitter in Colorado. And then Angelica Talon from Washington, D.C. So, thank you.
A little bit of time for some discussion. I'm hoping that this has done for you what it has for me, which is to make me want to go outside and buy a copy of the book. Oh, yeah.
All proceeds go to the Spokane River Keepers.
All right, so we've got a couple of minutes, and I'd love to hear your questions. Maybe to get one started, Greg, Gordon, Dr. Gordon, you had mentioned an offhand comment that, in a way, could you say that the planet is a novel ecosystem? If in the Anthropocene, if we've altered the very geology of the planet, is the whole planet itself now, in a sense, a novel ecosystem, no longer wild?
Some ecologists would say yes. They would be probably in the minority because of those characteristics of a novel ecosystem. Certainly the planetary system is changed. Certainly we've altered every system on Earth, from the climate to the hydrology to species composition to just the sheer biomass. If I can pull it off the top of my head, if I recall correctly, something like 60% of the world's terrestrial biomass are humans and livestock. So obviously we've had a very significant impact, and then all of those things combined is what creates the Anthropocene. Whether or not that means the entire world is a novel ecosystem is probably up for debate amongst ecologists, but I would say probably not. There's plenty of places that don't meet those 5 characteristics.
Fair enough. I'm going to turn to you all in just a second. So get a question going here. And I'm not sure who to pose this to necessarily, but I'm wondering if, in addition to rewilding the river, and maybe Heidi, I'll start with you. Is there a sense in which we're rewilding ourselves as well? Is there the human relationship here? There's what we do with and to the river in terms of the dams and the free flowing, but it seems like there's an attitudinal aspect to this too, and I feel like maybe starting with you and then maybe to Bob.
I think that's a great question, and it's a beautiful sentiment. And I do think that, based on how he set up the book of our changing relationship with rivers, I do think that there is a changing cultural relationship we're having with nature, where we're, and I can't speak for everyone. I feel like, for me personally, and I think for my children, kind of what I see around me, I think people are interested in having a reciprocal relationship and a sustainable relationship with nature. I'll see if the other people have.
Bob?
I absolutely believe, I'm a sociologist by training, so I absolutely believe that a cultural shift is happening, that it's been happening among a fair number of people and populations and places to do that wilding in themselves, to to make those connections to nature that they woke up one morning and realized they've lost, just like when you were talking about your own experience. I think that's happening more and more, unfortunately, as we see less and less. So I do see hope that way, but what I said in my talk just now, I think is one of the for me anyway, it's one of the biggest things that will make a difference, and that's when we do whatever we do, that we include people, and I don't know if I ever mentioned this to Margot, but include people that were excluded or removed. We've got to have that wisdom. It's called indigenous wisdom for a reason, right? And I don't know if you've ever read the book Rights of Nature. Anybody? Rights of Nature? When I read it, I found myself laughing in the book. It's pretty tragic, but I found myself laughing because I'm thinking, it took a white lawyer to write a book that's had so much impact. We could just ask the Spokane tribe, right? Well, anyways, back to your point. I think we are making progress in that direction of wilding ourselves in order to save the planet.
So as I shared a little bit about the local tribes, we're organized kind of scientifically, if you will, under UCUT, Upper Columbia United Tribes. And our tribes, I don't know if it was 6 or 8 years ago, time after COVID, right? We all obtained 800-year-old cedar logs in which our tribal communities each were given a log, and we carved those, and we had to figure out how our traditional technologies, because we have been so cut off for 150, 177 years from our traditional transportation highways of the rivers. And so when I talk about Francis Cluya saying, returning once again to our traditional pathways, that I was talking about our tribes once again paddling in canoes down those rivers, and that our young people being challenged and being strengthened and learning the songs and speaking their language. This is a reconnection to the river, and as part of that rewilding process, we too are finding our way back to the river.
All right, any questions or comments from the audience? Let's start over here. If you just maybe mention your name, if you would.
Hi, thank you guys for your presentation. My name is Alicia Orloff. I work for Conservation Northwest. And my question was a little bit about Lake Arthur, and maybe about also kind of connecting with rewilding ourselves. And as I kind of run around the river, I always see there's evidence of beaver. You mentioned that there might be reintroduction of beaver, or just whatnot, restoration of beaver to the Lake Arthur area. And I always kind of assumed that there was maybe some kind of management of beaver along the river. And so I'm curious about who manages those beaver at Lake Arthur. Are there coexistence issues? And kind of on that larger picture and those implications, does that mean that us as a society maybe aren't ready for some of those species? And when we think of societally, like, are we really ready for that kind of rewilding?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I think that's why I like the term rewilding, because it suggests that we have to let go a little bit. That if using the beavers as an example, right? They showed up. It was an accidental rewild. They weren't planted here. They weren't intentionally brought back. They found their way. They found their way down the river and showed up. And yeah, they're quote a problem if you're trying to manage for a designed ecosystem. Around Lake Arthur, it's Gonzaga property, and so the grounds crew basically fences off the cottonwoods to keep the beavers from eating them rather than trapping them. I think you're sitting next to someone who can speak more about beaver relocation in the inland Northwest. But I think that raises the question: is are we ready for these critters to show up on our doorstep? And I think that's the tension. You know, I always get a kick out of, I don't know if you guys look at Nextdoor, you know, the social media app for neighborhoods, and I always find it fascinating there's a coyote in the neighborhood, and then the amount of comments that are on, save your pets, we have to do something about the coyotes and the turkeys and the moose and the quail, and then there's a whole list of other comments about, wait, they were here first, it's up to us to adapt to them. And so I think Nextdoor would be great sociological study, like looking at like all the back and forth. And I think that's what we're seeing today is it's not just a monolithic sort of response. I think there's just a whole diversity of people's interest. And I think one of the things to think about when we think about rewilding ourselves, you know, a lot of us are from the generation where nature was supposed to be out there, away and separate, and the city was the place we lived, and the nature was a place we visited. And I think this is the opportunity that we're in today, is like, especially for younger generations, it's like, well, there's nature's in our face, and those beavers are here. And what does that mean? Like, what do we do with that? How do we ethically how do we be in relationship to those animals? How do we figure out a way that humans and wildlife can coexist, that it's not just an urban space? The Spokane River is a great ecological corridor, right? It can connect Mount Spokane to Riverside State Park. There's other people here that can talk a lot more about that, the importance of those connections than I can. But I think there's opportunity, especially when we start thinking about urban environments as conservation opportunities, not just places where people live and nature stays out.
Go over here, and if you mentioned your name, and also if you had a question for a specific panelist.
My name is Constance Holland. I'm also an oral storyteller and a sociologist by training. So I'm reading a book called Reindeer Chronicles about regenerating natural places. And the filmographer John Liu says he no longer talks about it as degradation of the land, loss of environmental species, but rather degradation of the human condition, loss of pieces of our humanity, loss of our culture, and sees that the recovery of that recognition of our humanity is what will eventually bring the two together. And I'd really just like to hear from the panel what you think of that. It was kind of an eye-opening thing for me, so I'm really interested. This panel hit right on the right time.
Anyone feel like taking that one?
I would just say, you know, again, that the tribes are working really hard to restore the water, and it brings the importance of ecology and water quality to the forefront. But I think all of us can do our part, water conservation, and then just keeping our city partners accountable. You know, we still have point source pollution, pipes that run right into the river. The city has made amazing investments on storage tanks, on the sewage treatment plant. We're doing a lot of work to protect the river, but we can do better. And I think it's all of our responsibility, because one day if we didn't have salmon, just think we would no longer have orca whales. And we've seen the J-pod and the mama who pushed her baby for 13 days that died from malnutrition because there's simply not enough salmon. And so I think we all have to do our part to protect the other species. And I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that was on my heart.
Just to continue on that question, I think that,
you know, it's hard to deprogram our brains. Many of us who grew up believing that humans are separate from nature, and that constant reminding that we are part of nature, we belong here too, and therefore we have a role to play that's maybe different from the role we've been playing. Maybe that is recovering our humanity, and I think there's a lot to learn from the indigenous tradition of living as part of nature, where we're not in the center of it, we're not directing it, we're not in charge of it, but we're just one of the species. So that's what I'd add to that.
Let's take one more over here.
Hi, I'm Connie, and I have a comment back to when you were talking about the hope, that's what I would call it, the hope of the next generation. I grew up in Orient on the Kettle River that goes into the Columbia River, and have lived my entire life on either the Columbia or a tributary of it. So I jokingly tell people I'm a person of the river, and I'm not trying to co-opt our good native tribal people. But my mother just turned 90, and here's what I have to say. I did not know until I was probably 50 that growing up along the Kettle, my mother was at the big celebration when Roosevelt came in to celebrate the Grand Coulee Dam. And from my mother's perspective, it was always about electricity. You talked about that. Somebody talked about, cheap power. Maybe it was Margot. And I am in a generation that says, I don't really care about cheap power, thank you very much. It bothers me that our rivers have been polluted. It bothers me that the salmon were taken away from our indigenous peoples along those rivers. And what brings me great joy and delight is I have 3 grown adult children, and this past summer we went camping, and my 2 grandchildren, I have pictures of them playing in a small creek that feeds into a river, and the love they have of nature. So I think there's hope. I don't know if that's a rewilding. I hope I've had something to do about that, because I've been giving them books about nature and about, salmon and our people here. They all grew up in this area. So thank you all. And one of the things I would say, it always bothered me that Spokane had a motto, near nature and near perfect. And I'm like, damn, folks, we live right in the middle of it. Like, we're not near it, we're in it, as Heidi said.
Thank you. Maybe you have one more over here in the middle. Your name?
Micah. I'm a student here. This is kind of a question that ties a lot of this together. But so historically, areas that hold rich ecological resources, both here in Spokane and nationally, and significant cultural and spiritual value, have been quantified and sacrificed in favor of obtaining ecological resources for technological progression, which, for example, with the dam, just as we cannot return our ecosystems to their natural states, but rather we rewild them due to this interconnectedness between society and nature, what are the first steps that we should take to rewild ourselves on a both communal and national level in the face of technological progression?
Is that one of your students?
No, but I wish he was. Okay, that's a great question. I don't want to give a short answer, but I would say, in terms of stepping to open up those pathways to rewilding our inner selves that Heidi mentions, is doing something. Volunteering with the riverkeeper and doing river cleanups. Getting out with restoration efforts. There's all sorts of nonprofit organizations all around town In the Northwest Land Conservancy, Spokane River Keeper, Spokane River Forum, Lands Council, it goes on and on in terms of the people that are out there always looking for volunteers. I mean, one of the great things that I did when I came to Spokane was go out and plant trees with hundreds of other people, and it was so inspiring, just the sheer action of putting a tree in the ground. You understood the connection not just between you and taking tangible effort, but also the connection that all those other people have. And one of the amazing things about restoration or rewilding kind of efforts is that it transcends the political spectrum. And I think in today's world, when everything is so polarized, that people can come together around place and their love of a river. I mean, you have people, and you know this from the fly fishing world, right? You have people of all political stripes that are out there, love fishing, and they love rivers, and they want to see them clean and healthy. And I think you begin the conversation there, and then you can sort of get to where you're headed with that deeper question. I don't know if that answers the question or not. Okay. You want to add to that?
C on that.
I got a C on that. That's I already graduated.
I would try something even way simpler than that. I would make a promise to yourself that every day for a month, you go down to the river, take your shoe and sock off and stick your foot in it. Or you stick your hand in it. That every day for a certain period of time, we commit to going to the river for no other reason than to sit next to it. Just start there. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
When I go down and I speak to city council, I'm a professor at Eastern in urban planning, and I talk to them about the Napaimut people in Alaska. When the tribal council in Napaimut gather and meet, they pass around a bucket of dirt, and each of them take a bite, and the older ones, big chunks. And so when I go to city council, I brought a jar of water from the Spokane River. And I said, before you make decisions for our city, contemplate taking a drink of our Spokane River. And in fact, of course, our Spokane River is connected to our aquifer. So all of us have to do our part to help with the river keepers and help folks that are cleaning it up and to conserve water. Spokane residents have the benefit of the cheapest water, and we abuse it and waste 5 times the amount other city residents do in Seattle and other cities. And so we can all do our part. Thank you.
So this book is for sale outside. I hope that you consider getting it. If you're online, I'm sure you can get it there too. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you at another event real soon.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. That was great.
That was so good. Are all of the essays that good, Greg?